4. September days. This case was the war begun by the Prussian government after the 18th of March against Denmark at the instructions of the German League in the Schleswig-Holstein question. Holstein was a German district and belonged to the German League. Schleswig was not a member of the League and its northern section at least was preponderatingly Danish. Both duchies were connected with Denmark by a joint ruling house, although in Schleswig-Holstein the principle of exclusively male succession prevailed whilst in Denmark, which was very little larger and very little more populated than the two duchies, both male and female succession were permissible. Schleswig and Holstein had a joint administration and enjoyed state independence together. That at least was the formal relation of Denmark to the two duchies according to international treaties, but in fact up to the verge of the 19th century the German spirit was dominant in Copenhagen and the German language was the official language of the kingdom while the nobles of Schleswig-Holstein exercised decisive influence in Danish governmental circles. During the Napoleonic Wars national antagonisms began to develop. In the Vienna treaties Denmark had to pay for its loyalty to the heir of the Great French Revolution with the loss of Norway. And in the struggle for existence it was forced to annex Schleswig-Holstein because the gradual expiration of the male line of its ruling house imminently threatened the complete separation of the two duchies from Denmark, and in such circumstances they would fall into the possession of a collateral line. Denmark began to emancipate itself as far as possible from German influence, and as it was too small to develop a really national spirit it began to foster a sort of artificial Scandinavianism with a view to uniting itself with Norway and Sweden in a joint cultural community. The attempts of the Danish government to obtain complete control over the two Albion duchies met with obstinate resistance within the latter, and the conflict soon developed into a national question for Germany. Particularly after the formation of the Zollverein, Germany began to recognize the importance of the Schleswig-Holstein isthmus for its flourishing trading and maritime relations, and it welcomed resistance to Danish propaganda in Schleswig-Holstein with increasing approval. From 1844 onwards the song Schleswig-Holstein Muemschlungen became a sort of national anthem. The movement certainly did not go much beyond the usual sleepy and boring tempo of pre-March agitation, but the German governments were not able to free themselves completely from its influence. In 1817, King Christian VIII of Denmark made a decisive move in the game by issuing a royal letter declaring the Duchy of Schleswig, and even part of the Duchy of Holstein, to be integral parts of the Kingdom of Denmark. And now even the German Federal Diet pulled itself together sufficiently to lodge a lame protest instead of declaring itself non-competent as was its custom whenever it was necessary to defend the interests of the German people against princely violence. The Neue Rheinische Zeitung naturally felt not the least sympathy for the sea-surrounded, pot-thumping enthusiasms of the bourgeoisie, which it regarded as the reverse side of Scandinavianism, enthusiasm for a brutal, grubby, piratical old Nordic nationality which is unable to express its deep-seated aspirations in words, but certainly can in deeds, namely, in brutality towards women, chronic drunkenness, and alternate sodden sentimentality and berserker fury. The situation shifted in the most extraordinary fashion because it was the bourgeois opposition in Denmark, the party of the so-called Ida Danes, which fought under the banner of Scandinavianism, which wanted to make the Duchy of Schleswig Danish, to extend Denmark's economic activities and to consolidate the Danish state by giving it a modern constitution. And on the other hand the fight in the two duchies for the old established rights developed more and more into a struggle for feudal traditions and dynastic privileges. In January 1848, Frederick VII came to the throne of Denmark as the last of the male line, and in accordance with the deathbed advice of his father he immediately began to prepare a liberal constitution for Denmark and for the two duchies. A month later the February Revolution in Copenhagen awakened a vigorous people's movement which brought the Ida Danes into power, and the latter immediately began to put their program into execution with relentless energy, aiming at annexation of the Duchy of Schleswig up to the River Elbe. The two duchies then declared themselves independent of the Danish royal house, formed a provisional government in Kiel and raised an army of 7,000 men. The aristocracy had the upper hand in the provisional government, and instead of mobilizing the resources of the two duchies, which were quite in a position to pit themselves against Denmark, the government appealed to the German Federal Diet and to the Prussian government for assistance. for it had no cause to fear that either of these bodies would attempt to interfere with the feudal privileges of the aristocracy. It found willing support from these two bodies, which gladly seized on the defense of the German cause as a convenient opportunity of recovering from the heavy blows dealt by the revolution. After the signal defeat of his Guards regiments at the hands of the Berlin barricade fighters on the 18th of March, the Prussian king was anxious to re-establish their prestige by a military walkover, and Denmark, which was militarily weak, seemed to offer the desired opportunity. The king hated the Eider Danes as one of the fruits of the revolution, but at the same time he regarded the Schleswig-Holsteiners as rebels against a God-given authority, and he therefore instructed his generals to perform their lackey service for the revolution in as dilatory fashion as possible. At the same time he sent a secret envoy to Copenhagen in the person of Major von Wildenbroek to inform the Danish government that he wished above all that Schleswig-Holstein should retain its ducal rulers, and that he was intervening merely in order to forestall the radical and republican elements. However, Denmark was not deceived by this message, so it appealed to the great powers for assistance, and both Great Britain and Russia proved very willing to grant it. Their help permitted little Denmark to pummel big Germany like a schoolboy. The Danish men of war struck crippling blows at Germany's maritime trade, but the German Federal Army under the command of the Prussian General Wrangel invaded the two duchies, and despite miserable generalship pressed back the weak Danish forces, only to find its military successes rendered nugatory by the diplomatic intervention of the great powers. At the end of May Wrangel received orders from Berlin to withdraw his troops from Jutland, whereupon, on the 9th of June, the National Assembly announced that the cause of the two duchies was the cause of the German nation, and therefore came within the province of the Assembly, which would undertake to defend Germany's honor. The war was in fact being conducted in the name of the German League, and its leadership should have been in the hands of the National Assembly and the Habsburg prince it had elected regent. But the Prussian government ignored these facts, and on the 28th of August, under English and Russian pressure, it concluded the 7 months' truce of Malmö, at the same time treating with contempt the conditions put forward by the regent and utterly ignoring his representative. The terms of the truce were ignominious for Germany. The provisional government of Schleswig-Holstein was dissolved, and supreme control for the period of the truce placed in the hands of a Danish supporter. The decrees of the provisional government were cancelled, and the Schleswig and Holstein troops separated from each other. Germany also suffered a distinct military disadvantage, for the truce embraced the whole of the winter season, during which the Danish fleet would have been helpless and unable to blockade the German coasts, whilst the German troops would have been able to take advantage of the ice to cross the Little Belt and conquer Fyn, thus reducing Denmark to the island of Zealand. The news of the signing of the armistice arrived in the first days of September and burst like a bombshell in the Frankfurt National Assembly, whose deputies were endlessly discussing with the washerwoman loquacity of medieval scholastics the fundamental rights of the future Reich Constitution. In their first consternation, the deputies actually decided on the 5th of September to veto the armistice, and this caused the resignation of the Reich ministry. This decision was welcomed with lively satisfaction, but without any illusions by the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, which demanded the prosecution of the war against Denmark as a result of historical development quite apart from any treaty rights. The Danes are a people unconditionally dependent on Germany commercially, industrially, politically and in literature. It is a well-known fact that Hamburg is the capital of Denmark and not Copenhagen, and that Denmark derives its literary imports from Germany in the same way as it does its material imports. With the sole exception of Holberg, Danish literature is nothing but a feeble copy of German literature. Germany must take Schleswig with the same justification that France took Flanders, Alsace and Lorraine, and sooner or later will take Belgium. Against barbarism, of progress against stagnation. The war which we are waging in Schleswig-Holstein is a real national war. Mark from the beginning. Three most counter-revolutionary powers in Europe, Russia, England and the Prussian government. The Prussian government waged the war only in appearances. The willingness with which Prussia evacuated Jutland at the request of England and Russia, and now the conclusion of this armistice. Revolution and its first fruit, German unity. To exist, England because the German market would be lost to its exploitation, and Russia because democracy would advance thereby not only to the Vistula, but to the Dvina and the Dnieper. Prussia, England and Russia have conspired together against Schleswig-Holstein, against Germany, against the revolution. The war which may come about as a result of the Frankfurt decisions would be a war of Germany against Prussia, England, and Russia. The German revolutionary movement needs such a war to rouse it from its lethargy, a war against the three great powers of the counter-revolution. A war which would finally make Prussia an integral part of Germany, which would make an alliance with Poland an urgent and unavoidable necessity, which would immediately give Italy its freedom and be waged directly against the old counter-revolutionary allies of Germany from 1792 to 1815. A war which would endanger the fatherland and save it just because the victory of Germany would depend on the victory of democracy. These clear and sharp passages from the Neue Rheinische Zeitung reflected what the revolutionary masses instinctively felt. Thousands of men streamed into Frankfurt from a radius of 50 miles around, ready and eager for new revolutionary struggles, but, as the Neue Rheinische Zeitung pointed out, such a struggle would abolish the National Assembly itself, and the latter preferred suicide by cowardice to suicide by heroism. On the 16th of September it gave its approval to the Truce of Malmö, whilst with one or two exceptions, the representatives of its left wing rejected a demand that it should constitute itself as a revolutionary convention. The only fighting which took place was a minor barricade engagement in Frankfurt itself, and even this was deliberately permitted to grow by the worthy regent in order to give him a pretext for bringing in an overwhelming force of troops from the neighboring federal garrison of Mayence and overawing the sovereign parliament with its bayonets. At the same time the Hansemann ministry in Berlin was overtaken by the miserable fate which the Neue Rheinische Zeitung had prophesied for it. It had strengthened the state power against the forces of anarchy, thus assisting the old Prussian military, police and bureaucratic state to rise to its feet again after the buffeting it had received on the 18th of March. But it had not even succeeded in furthering the brazen profit interests of the bourgeoisie for which it had betrayed the revolution. And above all, as a member of the Berlin Assembly sighed dolefully, despite the breach in the March days, the old military system is with us in its entirety again. This was true. And since the Paris June days it had resumed its menacing saber-rattling almost automatically. It was an open secret that one of the reasons why the Prussian government had agreed so readily to the truce with Denmark was its desire to recall from Ireland his troops to the neighborhood of Berlin in order to prepare a counter-revolutionary coup. On the 7th of September, therefore, the Berlin Assembly plucked up sufficient courage to demand from the Minister for War that he should issue an order warning all army officers against reactionary activities and calling upon all those officers whose political convictions ran counter to the existing constitutional situation to resign their commissions as a matter of honor. This demand was really of no very great importance, particularly as similar appeals had in fact already been issued to the members of the bureaucracy without producing any result whatever. But it was more than militarism was prepared to stand from a bourgeois ministry. The Hansemann ministry fell and a purely bureaucratic ministry was formed under General Pfuhl, who then calmly issued the orders in question to the officers' corps as proof to the world that militarism no longer feared the bourgeoisie and was now in a position to mock at it. In this way the petulant, super-clever and impotent assembly experienced the fulfillment of the prophecy of the Neue Rheinische Zeitung that one fine morning its left wing would wake up to find that its parliamentary victory had coincided with its material defeat. Replying to the hubbub raised by the counter-revolutionary press, which declared that the victory of the left wing had been won under the pressure of the Berlin masses, the Neue Rheinische Zeitung spurned the lame denials of the liberal newspapers and declared frankly the right of the democratic masses of the people to exercise a moral influence on the actions of constitutional assemblies by their presence is an old revolutionary right, and no period since the English and French revolutions has seen its abandonment. History has to thank this right for almost all the energetic steps taken by such assemblies. This hint was directed as much to the parliamentary cretinism of the Frankfurt Assembly in those September days of 1848 as to the Berlin Assembly.